Well, I think the key issue is how do we achieve an integrated transport policy in Wales? At the moment, we don't have the necessary responsibilities or powers or funding mechanisms. The Wales and Borders franchise is run by the Department for Transport with the Welsh Government as a co-signatory. The funding is done by the Welsh Government. That doesn't seem to quite make sense. Secondly, the other aspect of public transport which needs to be integrated are the buses. But bus regulation is the responsibility of the Department for Transport. Now, that needs to be transferred in terms of the legislative responsibility to the National Assembly, who can then decide whether Wales ought to have regulated bus services, which would mean franchising, or whether it should have the current market-led facility, which doesn't work because the bus companies don't have to work with the train companies. There are other aspects then, which, for example, as these two commissioners done, looked at the report, looked at ports and how investment should be made in ports. The Welsh Government and indeed the European Commission feel that is a function of the companies themselves, that it is a private sector responsibility. Now, in doing that, it comes from two sources. One is the British government in London look at Southampton and Felixstowe, which are very successful businesses, very large companies, and they invest everything themselves. They do it all. We've got much smaller ports in Wales, and we also have to look in Wales at the quality of the infrastructure, both road and rail, between the ports and the big markets, not just in England, but also overseas, because we can then maybe attract more ships into Welsh ports where we have capacity. The other issue, and it comes up quite clearly in the tourism business, ports make no money out of tourism, out of cruise ships, but the local economy does. But under the present setup, because of the preoccupation of the European Commission with funding of private companies, the Welsh Government is not able, for example, to build a new berth at Holyhead or maybe at Milford Haven, where there is deep water ports, deep water facilities, and where shipping companies, the big cruise companies like Royal Caribbean and Carnival, can bring their big 3,500 passenger ships in and make an enormous difference to the local economy.
Funding is a huge issue for these. How does this reconcile with your research?
Well, what we found, just as an example, really, one example of the failure to integrate buses and trains has been with the Trawscymru operation. That was set up by the government 4 years ago as a government-owned business, which would franchise out or contract out rather the operations to private companies. But the control of the operation itself, the integration of timetables, ticketing and so on, would be in the hands of the Trawscymru board and its staff. Now, that scheme works really well between Cardiff and Newtown. The business has been set up, it's the T4 service, it has the lowest subsidy level per passenger. Probably in Britain, it is 5p per passenger. Most rural services are between £3 and £4 per passenger trip. Now, that shows how successful it's been. The T9 service to the airport will develop in the same way. It's that kind of quality. Now, we tried to set up, Trawscymru tried to set up the T1 service between Carmarthen and Aberystwyth, but they failed to do that very simply because Arriva Buses Cymru registered a service perfectly legally under the Transport Act 1985. That stopped that service being developed. All sorts of arrangements had been made at Carmarthen Station, for example, to improve the infrastructure, the connectivity, the links between Arriva Trains Wales and Trawscymru. All that had been set in motion and was ready to go. The tenders were out for the bus operations, and Arriva came in, registered a service, and because the Transport Act says you cannot run a subsidised service at the same time and on the same route as a commercial service, then that service couldn't go forward. 2.5 years later, Arriva Buses Cymru have pulled out of Mid Wales completely, and they are now only on the North Wales coast. Now, that kind of operation can't continue. That kind of situation can't continue. That has to be brought together with the rail company, which is franchised by the Welsh Government. So that's and they say themselves, we are an organisation who work within a framework. We must also get the bus companies working within a framework. I know there are difficulties because some bus companies have worked hard to create profitable services. But many times what we find is that the profitable part of a route or a time of day is what the companies want to run commercially. And the local authorities finish up with the loss-making sections of that operation. Early morning, evening, Sundays, bank holidays. Those kinds of services have got to be brought in together with the profitable services. Now, the other issue, I think, with bus operations is that they tend to finish at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the evening. Maybe some in Cardiff to go on later than that. But it gives the opportunity then of deciding how much revenue is available, how much revenue support is available, subsidy if you like, how much of that is available for those services which are socially necessary or which might in fact become commercial if only people could get back on them in the evening. Because very often people will say, well, I can go into Carmarthen on the bus at 7 o'clock, but I can't get back. Now, that kind of operation is something that we need to look at. And unless those services are fully integrated, both with one another and with the train services, we're not going to get the kind of shift from the motor car to public transport that the government actually wants.